come here and speak to you. And second, I'd like to say that I'm not very good at speeches, but what I'm going to tell you comes from my heart. It's not rehearsed. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my father. His name is Dr. Orlando Bosch. He is presently incarcerated here in Miami Correctional Center, which is a federal detention. A little background on my father. We are from Cuba, and in 1951, my father met my mother in medical school, and they both graduated as doctors and got married. My father worked for a hospital in Cuba and was in private practice, and all his salary from the hospital went strictly to the orphanages or toys for children. In 1958-59, we had the unfortunate incident of having Batista overthrown in Cuba and Castro try to take over. In '59, my father came to this country and warned this country and the CIA about what Fidel Castro was really doing, that he was not just trying to overthrow Batista, but he was being backed by the Russians, and tried to tell them where all his ammunition and all his equipment was, and they laughed at him and sent him back. My father then proceeded to come again to the United States that same year because he had 24 hours to leave Cuba or he would be killed by Castro. He came into this country in 1960 and was trained and worked with the CIA along with being a pediatrician. Worked in Abbey Hospital here. And I don't know if you all are aware of the CIA's involvement before the Bay of Pigs invasion. There was a lot of war with Cuba. In 1968, my father was arrested for the bazookaing of a Polish freighter going on MacArthur Causeway. And what he did was wrong, but we might wonder if our country was taken away, if our religion was taken away, if our property was taken away, if our dignity was taken away, what we all might do in a situation like that. My father was given 10 years incarceration. He did 4 years in 1968. In 1972, he was released on parole. When he was released on parole, my father still could not give up his fight for Cuba, and my father's life was being threatened here in the United States. My father went and left this country and broke his parole. When he left because, for a number of reasons, one of them was his life was being threatened by Castro again. And you might say, yes, he could have gone to his parole officer and said, my life is in danger, but what good would it have done if he would have gone home and his house would have been blown up? So my father had to leave this country. And he went underground, and he went all over South America and Central America trying to find new ways to help free Cuba from communism. In 1976, a Cubana airliner plane blew up, leaving Barbados, 73 people on board. My father had absolutely no involvement in that. There were other people involved. There have been confessions that have been made by the people that were involved who have after that been murdered. The Venezuelan government, Castro wanted to set him up, so he got the Venezuelan government, which at the time the president was Carlos Andres Perez, to set my father up. He called my father, found him in Costa Rica, asked him to come to Venezuela. He would help him fight the war against Castro. He issued my father a fake passport. He says, we do this to VIPs. He paid for the hotels. He did everything to help my father. When my father came into the country, it was all a setup. Castro and President Perez were very good friends, and Castro wanted my father imprisoned because he believed that my father had something to do with that. They arrested him for a fake passport, for entering the country illegally, for everything that the president had invited him in for. He was arrested in 1976. He was imprisoned for 4 years before they finally gave him his first trial. When they gave him his first trial, in order to get that first trial date, he had to go on a hunger strike for almost 30 days. With the help of people from Miami and people all over the United States, he managed to get his first trial. He was tried, and they said no. He threatened them. He closed his embassies in Venezuela. He pulled out his diplomats. He threatened the judges with their lives. They kept him in for another 4 years. They said, we don't have jurisdiction. Now we have to transfer it to the civil court. They transferred it to the civil court. After transferring it to the civil court found him not guilty again. Now this is the second time he's being tried for the same crime, which is something I think that you only do in communist countries where there's no justice at all. And he was found not guilty. They keep him again. This is his second hunger strike for him to get his second trial. They keep him again for another 4 years. He wants the Supreme Court, they say the Supreme Court has to uphold the decision now. So On his third hunger strike, my father, he's on his 56th day of his third hunger strike. The people in Miami decide to get involved. 21 men hunger strike here in solidarity with my father in the streets of Miami for 20 days. Miami decides to get involved. Monsignor Walsh, at the time Mayor Ferre, and a lot of elected officials went to Venezuela to beg the president to please let the man go or give him a date when he can be released. On his 58th day, they finally decided to give him a date. During all this time, we have gone before the United Nations, we have gone before the Organization of American States, we have gone before Amnesty International, and they have all condemned Venezuela because of its violation of human rights with my father. Even the State Department of this country has condemned Venezuela in their yearly books of countries that they say violated human rights of individuals. Finally, they decide to give him a date. The Supreme Court then decides they're gonna, in 2 more years is what it takes for the Supreme Court to finally decide that they're gonna release him. 11 years later, my father says, this is ridiculous. I'm going on a hunger strike again, and if I have to die, I will, but I'm not gonna spend 40 years here because of pressure from Cuba. They finally decide to release him. They released my father in December of 1987. He had no documentation and no papers, so they had to hold him for 3 or 4 months while they got him documentation. My father's life was so much in danger from Castro that the government had to issue my father 6 bodyguards for those 3 or 4 months that he was there, just to make sure that they would not be responsible for his life. My father entered this country on February 16th, 1988, my younger sister's birthday, and was immediately arrested. He came to this country, we had applied for a visa for him to come here. He came to this country because he wanted to do what he thought was right, which was to turn himself in for the violation of parole in 1972, which is exactly what he's in jail for now, for entering the country, not for the violation of parole. So it's like you can't win no matter what you do. He was given we went before Judge Rice-Camp to have him released on bond pending a parole commissioner's decision. Judge Rice-Camp decided that he wanted a second hearing on this because he wanted all the evidence. So he remained in jail, and then they decided to give him a hearing on an emergency basis because of my father's health. Let me tell you a little bit about my father's health. My father's had 3/4 of his stomach removed. He suffers from angina. He suffers from bleeding ulcers. They bleed all the time. He has to have about half a bottle of Maalox along with a special diet daily, which he is not getting now. He just had a prostate cancer surgery last year, and they really butchered him, and he's suffering from a lot of complications from that. So he's not your normal, everyday, healthy man. He's 62, which is not old, but he's 62 going on 92. And he's been through a lot of emotional trauma with everything he's been through. So Judge Rice-Camp orders him to be released to the hospital. The United States government says, absolutely not. We want to stay on this decision. My father almost had a heart attack in jail here. He lost 15 pounds in a matter of a month due to the diet, because he needs special diet. The United States government said, no, we're going to appeal this. Finally, he gets his parole commission hearing. The parole commissioner hears us. At the parole commission hearing is his ex-prosecutor, his ex-parole officer. Everybody is there in favor of him because they realize the man has been through so much, in prison for 11 years for something he didn't even do. They decide, after hearing us out, they decide to give him only 3 months. He is to be released May 16th, out on parole, paroled out on the street to be with his family. My father wrote a letter to this country, promising this country that he understands that he can no longer free his country by the means that he tried to in the early 60s. He publicly wrote that letter and said that he would abide by all the laws of the United States, and all he wanted was to be here with his family. On May 16th, immigration, INS said, I'm sorry, we're not allowing him to be released. We want the man deported. We don't want him in this country. He went before a hearing before Judge Hoovler. Judge Hoovler, in the parole commission hearing, we had an FBI agent specialist on terrorism and acts of violence. His name was Agent Kaczynski, who said that since 1968, they have been following my father, and they don't link him to any acts of violence. They don't link him to talking or speaking with anybody that has anything to do with any of these organizations of violent groups trying to free their countries. And that is why I think they only gave him 3 months parole. Now, all of a sudden, Judge Hubler's hearing, 2 or 3 months later, the United States government comes up with a new FBI agent that knows absolutely nothing about my father and nothing about terrorism and nothing about, this area of the country, and says, well, now we have 711 pages of classified information that we want you to read, Judge Hubler, why Orlando Bosch should not be released. 711 pages of classified information. I know a few ex-U.S. attorneys, and classified information is just gossip. Somebody said something to somebody else, or somebody heard somebody say something on the phone to somebody else, or saw somebody talking with somebody. And in this country, you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, not guilty until proven innocent. And Judge Hubler says, I need a few days to read this. He read it. He begged immigration to please release my father with monitoring devices, with anything they wanted, because his health was not good, and there was no reason. He's considered a hero to this community, and he hasn't really done anything except what he did in 1968 with a Polish freighter, and that was only to dent a Polish ship when nobody was on board, to let the people in Miami know that there was a communist ship going through MacArthur Causeway trading with Cuba, and he did that out of the desperation and frustration of having lost his country. And about the airplane, my father had nothing to do with the airplane, but what was really on that airplane, that was the time of the war with Angola, where soldiers sent from Cuba and ammunition, bazookas, all kinds of equipment sent to fight the war, and that was not found out until later when the newspapers got pictures of what was really on that airplane. So Judge Hubler asked him to be released, and they said no. On the way to that hearing, INS took my father, picked him up at 8 in the morning, and took him to Eastern Airlines, and let my father think that he was going to be deported at that time. They mentally tortured him for 3 hours. There was no reason to take him to Eastern Airlines. The cuffs that were put, I don't know how you call them, not handcuffs, but foot cuffs, broke all his blood vessels on his feet. Judge Hubler demanded from the United States government why this kind of treatment was done to my father on the way to the hearing. They had no excuse and no explanation. And just a lot of things have happened to my father, and there's no explanation for anything that happened except pressure from Cuba, from the Cuban government. My father is now in Section E in MCC. Section E is a section of the jail where you put the troublemakers of the jail and the people that are not well. Sometimes my father calls me on the phone and you hear fights in the background, and they say the reason they keep him there is because that is maximum security. And they don't want to release him to 900 other prisoners, and they're afraid what might happen to him. I think there's other things you can do besides put someone in a section with all the crazy people. And we have asked, when President Reagan came down here 2 or 3 months ago for Connie Mack's luncheon, President Reagan said publicly that he will give my father a full and fair hearing, because INS has said that he is an excludable alien, therefore he has no legal rights. And our argument is that he has got to have some human rights somewhere in the world, because wherever he goes, they do these things to him. And I think it's time for all this to stop. And President Reagan promised him a full and fair hearing, and that was over 3 months ago. My father's health is deteriorating fast. We asked INS for political asylum. 2 diplomats have come from Cuba in the past maybe 2 to 4 months, and the first thing that they have defected from Cuba, and the first thing they have come and said to the Miami Herald and to the television stations is that my father is #1 on Castro's list to be killed if he is deported the minute he gets deported. He has been publicly condemned to death. And knowing this, the U.S. government still is not willing to consider my father's situation, to consider his health, to consider his age, to consider that his whole family is here. And it's just been one thing after another, and it's been very difficult for us. We've tried to get the help of the media. We've been very successful. They've understood our plight. They've understood our situation. My father is not a terrorist. My father is not a violent man. He is someone who did what he thought he had to do for his country in the early 60s, and I'm not sure we wouldn't do the same thing if the United States was taken away from us. And it's been very difficult for us, but we're going to keep trying. We're going to keep fighting. We think that maybe after the elections we might get some kind of answer, because nobody wants to give us an answer now. Nobody wants to touch the issue. So hopefully, my father might be allowed to stay here. I doubt it, because immigration is coming down very hard on him. But I think that deporting him would be akin to a death warrant in my father's situation. And all I would ask of all of you is your prayers, and to please keep my father and us in mind.